I'm meeting all the guys, and there was one guy who was very much an engineer, exactly the kind of guy I was trying to get away. He talked in acronyms, he talked in tech speak, and that was not me, and I didn't like that. And when I left, I almost didn't take the job. I was like, do I really want to go back and do an engineering thing? And luckily, I said, you know what, I'll stick it out. You know, maybe if it turns out I don't like it, I can always quit. So I took the job, and I was hired in 1982 to be a video game programmer. So it was a very strange environment, very much a think tank environment. Gottlieb had purchased 2 Japanese games, and they had put those out, but they had yet to release their own in-house game. They hired Tim Skelly, who was the guru, the guy who had a track record, the superstar, or the name, if you will. And he was hired by Gottlieb to make a game, and that game became Reactor, which was Gottlieb's first game. And I was assigned to work with another guy, a programmer named Tom Malinowski, and he was working on like a superhero game. And it was really based on Superman 2, the movie Superman 2, where Superman's fighting the 3 villains from Krypton that had superpowers. And in this game, there were sides of buildings on the edge of the screen, and like Superman would, I shouldn't say Superman, it wasn't Superman, okay? It was just some superhero. This superhero would punch some villain, and he would go hit the building, and there would be rubble, like the building would, you know, some bricks and stuff would fall out. And there were little passersby, little tiny passersby, walking along back and forth on the bottom of the screen, and they might get hit by the rubble and die, and so you'd lose points for that. So the idea is you were trying to protect the people on the ground, because you couldn't kill these superheroes. Anyway, my job was to program a bulldozer that came by periodically and took the rubble off screen, because the rubble would make little piles and then, you know, clog the screen. Anyway, that was my first job. That game did not get released. It had problems. They tried, they believed in it very strongly, and they wanted to get that game released, but it went through a lot of changes. It was a joystick, it was a trackball. They called it different names. They called it Protector, then they called it Video Man, then they called it Guardian, and then they called it Argus. I don't know how Argus got in there. I don't know what the hell that meant, but we just joked about it and called it ProVidGuard Argus. But it really, and it was a good game, but I mean, you know, the guy who programmed it had never done a video game. This was something that Gottlieb was very big on. They would hire people not necessarily who had track records. They would hire people who they thought might have the potential, and it was very much, we had very much freedom to design whatever we wanted, do whatever we wanted. In some cases that worked out, in some cases that did not work out. Later on they changed their tune, I'll get to that in a little bit, but after this game got canceled, it was time for me to sort of, you know, do something of my own. And I think I'd learned enough to do that, but I still was new and I still was kind of green. It was now April of 1982, and another programmer named Kan Yamamoto, he did the game Mad Planets, if anybody's heard of Mad Planets. Later, he did that game, but at this time he was playing around with our hardware. And he was playing around with foregrounds and backgrounds, and you know, normally the foregrounds in the front, the backgrounds in the back, but we had a bit that could switch those, and so he was doing this thing where he was removing pieces of the background to reveal something going on behind it, the foreground going on behind it. The thing he was using for a background, or for a foreground, was an Escher pattern created by Jeff Lee. By the way, Jeff Lee also was the artist who created those little people who walked down, back and forth in ProVidGuard Argus. And I was astonished at what he could accomplish. These guys were like, you know, maybe 8 pixels tall. And they all had their own personalities and walks. And I was astonished with what this guy could do. He was an amazing artist. And he had come up with this, you know, sort of Escher-like pattern of hexagons that, you know, colored a certain way. They looked like cubes. And it filled the screen, and Kan was basically just removing pieces of them to reveal something going on behind it. But when I looked at it, I thought, this is interesting. You know, if you imagine this as a pyramid, then if a ball were to hit the top cube, it would have one of 2 choices which way to bounce. And if you had, you know, every time it hit, it would have to make a choice. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. In one byte, in a random number byte, you could use each bit to determine, am I going to go to the right or am I going to go to the left? And I thought of the balls bouncing, and I thought, okay, this is a great opportunity for me to learn something and to practice coding gravity and randomness. So for me, it was just a programming exercise. So I got to work. I asked Jeff Lee to make a pyramid out of these cubes and give me a ball that could drop. And I went at it, and I had a ball bouncing, and I programmed it, and I was like, wow, that's cool. And people would come by, and they'd look at it, and they go, wow, that's cool. I mean, it wasn't a game, it was just a programming exercise. Well, the next logical step is to have a player-controlled character to be on those cubes and hop around. So I went to Jeff, I said, do you have any characters lying around? And he did. He had a bunch of characters that he had made, hoping that they'd be used in a game. You know, one of the things about the culture at Gottlieb is the programmers were the designers. They were the directors of the project. And it was, you know, sort of understandable, because if a programmer didn't program something, it wasn't going to be in the game. You know, it's not like somebody else could code a feature. So at Gottlieb, all of the programmers were always in charge. The other thing was about Jeff is I think he was like the only artist in the entire company at the time, you know? So he was working on a lot of different games. Well, there weren't that many going on that time, but he would eventually be working on multiple games at one time. But he had these characters that he hoped some programmer would take and turn into a game, and he had ideas for that game, but I really wasn't interested in that. I just wanted to get a character to jump around. So I took the orange one, the big oval guy with the long nose. And of course, Jeff had designed him with the long nose, hoping he would shoot stuff out of that nose, but I wasn't interested in that either. So I just wanted him hopping around this pyramid, and I did that. And everybody walked by and they went, that's really cool. And I'm like, yeah, that's really cool. What are we going to do with that? Well, Ron Waxman, interesting guy. So I told you he was gruff, and he did have this gruff demeanor, but at heart he was a pussycat, and of course he loved everybody, but he wasn't demonstrative that way, but he liked to hang around in our little area. We had one big open area where everybody worked, and he just liked to hang around there sometimes late at night and just kind of watch us. And I remember this one time I was sitting there at the Blue Box. We worked on a Blue Box development kit as an Intel thing, pretty big. Had 9-inch floppy disks, if you can imagine that. And he's sitting behind me, and I just hear him breathing, you know. You know, and I'm working away. He's not saying a word. He's just sitting there watching me. And, you know, I guess I kind of got used to it after a while. But at one point, I'm just playing around with this character jumping around. And he goes, what if the tops of the cubes change color when he lands on them? I thought, yeah, that's a great idea. So we put that in, and lo and behold, that is really when Q Bert became a game. It wasn't called Q Bert, it was just a game that I was programming, and I called it the Cube game. You know, we didn't have a name for the character, that came later. And then things went pretty fast after that. He needed somebody chasing after him, and you know, Jeff had the snake character, and you know, he needed a way to escape the snake, and you know, and again, it all kind of came very, very quickly. In fact, I started playing around with it in April. I think it was done probably about September of that year. It was very much a collaboration. I love to hear people's ideas. A lot of people had ideas. A lot of people had a lot of bad ideas. I ended up being the filter. So if somebody said something and I didn't respond or think it was a good idea, it just didn't get in the game. But I did find Jeff to be a fantastic collaborator, as was Dave Thiel, who's here at the show. He might be here today. There he is. Who created the sounds. You know, Dave created the gibberish sound using the phoneme chip. I guess we talked about it a little bit. But you know, Dave and Jeff and I, you know, became the creative core, with me being the filter and them being collaborators. And it was a very lovely partnership, which I treasure to this day. This is my business card up here. You'll notice the address. That's our Bensonville address. At some point during the development of Q Bert, they moved us into the main place, the main plant in Northlake. And the interesting thing about that is, you know, all the pinball guys were there, and we were the video guys. Now, at this time, pinball was in kind of a slump. So the pinball guys were a little resentful towards us. Now, we didn't know any of this. And I got to say, you know, the management, they didn't do anything to make things easier. They didn't have a mixer or introduce us to each other. Literally, one day we just were thrown into this space, and the pinball guys were kind of shoved off into a corner. And, you know, we'd walk around and we'd be, you know, just think everything was cool. And then we'd walk by these guys, you know, looking at us, and we'd be like, well, why are those guys angry with us? But eventually we got to know them, and we sort of time sorted things out. I only have one picture of myself during the development of Q Bert. Can we go to the next slide? So there's a number of interesting things in here, the least of which is the way I look. But you can see the blue box. That was what we developed on at first. There was a time where we moved to IBM PCs, but here I'm still using the blue box. A couple of other interesting things. The monitor shows the screen upside down. I'm not sure why that is. I don't know, I might have been working on the tabletop version. There was a tabletop version of Q Bert, and so people sit at opposite sides of the screen. The table is flat. And so when you switch from player to player, there's a bit in the software, in the hardware, that lets you change the orientation so the players can change. Now, that might have been why that was upside down. The other interesting thing is if you look at the bottom left, you see there's a joystick that is actually mounted on the bottom of like a Tupperware bucket. That was my joystick that I used in the development. And the other interesting thing is it's a four-way joystick, right? And people were used to four-way joysticks being up, down, left, right. When I started developing Q Bert, it occurred to me that, you know, if you look at the cubes, the only directions he can jump are diagonal. You know, he's not jumping straight down, he's not jumping straight up. So it didn't make any sense. So I had to rotate the joystick to be at an angle. Well, this bothered a lot of people at Gottlieb. They were like, you can't have a joystick be diagonal. It's got to be up and down. I'm like, no, it doesn't. But this was actually, you know, so the Tupperware bucket had to be rotated because the thing was up and down. Can you go to the next slide? This is my new business card. If you look at the address, it says Northlake. So it's not any different. I really wanted to get a cooler title, you know, but they really weren't giving them out then. You know, I thought like Techno Geek or something, but no, it's software engineer. That's okay. So we got these new business cards. Let me see, what's the next slide? Let's go to the next slide. Oh, okay. So Q Bert was finished in September, and there's a trade show, there's a big trade show in November called the AMOA. I think that's what this is from. This was where Gottlieb introduced Q Bert to the world, and so they had a big, well, to the industry, and so they had a big, you know, a big spread. You know, it tested very well. I should also say, those of you who have never developed a video game, when you're developing a video game, tuning is a very difficult thing. I was talking to some of those Intellivision guys who talked yesterday, and then we were talking about tuning, and it is really interesting because we had an opportunity to put our games out into arcades for testing purposes, and we did that. There were certain arcades in the Chicago area that would let us take our new games that weren't released yet, and we would take these, we called them engineering samples. They looked like video games. We would put them out in an arcade, and we would literally just sort of linger in the background and just watch people play. You know, so people, they'd be in the arcade, they were looking like, oh, that's a new game. I haven't seen that one before. You know, and we would watch and see, did it interest them? Did they stay around? If they put a quarter in, did they stick around? You know, I saw many, many people put a quarter into Q Bert and just fly right off the pyramid. You know, they did that. They'd be like, what? What the? You know, okay. They get the next guy right off the pyramid. Like, what? All right, you know, and then they lose all their life. This game sucks, man. And they walk away. 5 minutes later, they were back, and they were trying it again. And that's kind of when we knew that we were on something. I did tune the game easier and easier as time went on because I did notice, you know, a lot of people were having trouble with it, and people at Gottlieb, most of them were terrible at it. But not that I think that should be the judge, because the video game designers aren't always the best players. But we did get information from watching people on tests, and we also did focus groups. Here's a very surreal experience. So you're in a room, a little conference room with a mirror that everybody must know is a two-way mirror. And we're on the other side watching all these people, and they're in there, and there's somebody in there who seems to be, not associated with the company or the video game, so he could be one of them. And he shows them the game, and everybody gets to play it, and then everybody gets to talk about it. The thing that I found most fascinating about focus groups is the discrepancy between how people behaved when they played the game versus what their comments would be afterwards. So they would be playing the game, they'd be like really into it, they'd be enjoying, you could see on their faces how much they were having a great time. And then afterwards they'd be like, yeah, it was okay. But we had to take what we could from that information. I usually based my responses on what I saw as opposed to what they said. But sometimes people had very valuable things to say. It was you had to be the filter. I had to be the filter. Anyway, I did tune it easier and easier and easier, and it got released. But I kind of wasn't happy with the tuning of it. I kind of hoped it would be, because we got word back that people were playing it for hours and hours. I had hoped that it would be a little harder. So I was tuning my own version. Even at the end of 1982, I was kind of tuning a harder version. And we also changed, I added some features. One of the things, the discs were static in the original Q Bert, but I thought, well, what if they actually start moving up the pyramid? You have to time your jumps, makes it harder. We made some changes to the way the levels progressed. And then we thought, well, maybe we could release this. And we actually put it out on test, but we put it out on test, I don't know, probably within a couple of months of the original Q Bert being released. So a lot of people weren't even familiar with the original Q Bert, and so management decided not to release it. And I don't know why they didn't just wait a year and release it, but they didn't, and so it never got released. Fast forward to 1997. I was working at Disney Interactive, and I was working with somebody who was involved with the MAME emulator. Is anybody familiar with the MAME project? So they had emulated Q Bert. They had, and since the hardware for faster, harder, more challenging Q Bert was the same hardware, I released the ROMs to him. And so nowadays, all of you can play my favorite Q Bert, faster, harder, more challenging. Let's take a look at the next slide. Oh, right, okay. This is a Q Bert calendar. I'm not even sure who drew this. I don't think it was Jeff Lee, but Dave Field was saying it might be Chris Brewer, right? It's another one of the programmers who's also a talented artist. He made a whole calendar. Actually, let's run the video, the first video. Now, I brought something somewhat rare. I actually found a video that I shot back behind the scenes at Gavi, showing some of the people that worked there. It's about 4 minutes long. The whole thing's about 12 minutes long. I edited it down because it would probably be excruciatingly boring. It's already excruciatingly embarrassing, I think, to all of us. But yeah, go ahead and just start it up.
Why are you bothering? Peggy, you met me earlier.